Hello and welcome to Looking into Cultures. We're fortunate again to be able to talk some more to Irene Maksymjuk, our guest, a Ukrainian-American friend and former colleague from Boston. And we'd also like to say hi to Frank. How are you doing, Frank?
I'm doing well, thank you.
And what about that thing on your lap?
This is Max. He's here to observe, and he's to be a good boy.
Well, he is a wonderful guest as well. Well, we're very happy to have more time to talk to Irene about Ukrainian culture, Slavic culture, Homo Sovieticus, and all these other interesting topics. But the first thing I would like to ask you is the differences in Ukrainian identity. You made a distinction between the Ukrainian diaspora, Soviet Ukrainians, and post-Soviet Ukrainians. Can you tell us the distinctions between those?
So let me just set the context for that comment, right? You had asked me to make cultural comparisons between Ukrainian culture and American culture. Mm-hmm. And I basically said that that would be very difficult for me to do because I grew up in the Ukrainian diaspora. And what that means is the culture that my parents brought out with them after World War II, right? Mm-hmm. And my parents never experienced the Soviet Union because they were already emigres. Right. So that's one cultural experience. Okay. People who spent their lives in the Soviet Union had particular cultural, political, socio-cultural experiences, starting with the Holodomor, which is hunger, basically genocide through hunger in the 30s in Ukraine. And then, of course, post-independence, Ukraine's now been independent since 1990, right? So there's a whole generation that was born and raised in an independent Ukraine, which, as we clearly see from current events, is quite distinct from Russia in the sense that move toward democracy and self-determination has been a huge part of what people have been striving for, right? People were out in the streets in two huge demonstrations insisting on their political and civic rights, right? So those are very different experiences that shape culture.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right?
Right. Interesting.
You worked in Ukraine for a long time and you traveled, so we want to tell us a little bit about that and your experiences working and living there?
So the first time I went was actually in 1989, which was before the fall of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. So that was actually very interesting. That was a reasonably short trip, 3 weeks, mm-hmm. Included time in Russia. And then after independence, I actually did English teacher training in Kiev one summer for, I guess we were there about 2 months.
Oh, wow.
About 2 months. That was very interesting, dealing with Ukrainians who taught English, mm-hmm. but all over Ukraine. Amazing experience. Their English abilities, and most of them had never ever been outside of Ukraine. They were really very impressive. I remember at that time thinking that the training they had was sort of the way their ballet dancers and their athletes are trained, like really precision is quite...
But didn't they do a lot of teaching themselves?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
but they taught themselves, from BBC tapes, from VOA, and their English proficiency was really astounding.
Well, I have to say it was the same in Russia when I was there. I couldn't believe it. Some of these people, they had never had opportunity to travel outside of the Soviet Union or Russia, because I went there in 2000, and their English was flawless. So it was the same thing. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were there great differences the first time you visited compared to the second time after the fall of the Soviet Union?
There were very noticeable differences.
Such as?
There were private business, by the time in the early 90s, there were private businesses. There was, stuff in stores.
Free enterprise and capitalism.
The stores were much better stocked. It was still tough for people economically in the early 90s, but there were clearly had been big changes. The thing for me about traveling there for the first time, and then in the first time actually we met a lot of writers and artists and people who had been involved in some dissident activity to one degree or another. But really the most, I would say, memorable experience was just walking down the street and, the people looked like me and my family. And it felt very familiar. Yeah.
In 89 or 90 or both? Or
Both. Both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said you felt very comfortable, like at home, in a sense, like. But the thing is that's interesting. You were there at 89 and then 90 because apparently the 90s. Oh,
Yeah.
in the 90s.
Yeah.
What year?
That was, I think, 92.
Okay, because as I
92 or
understand
93,
it,
I can't remember now.
As I understand it, the 90s were terrible turmoil for a lot of people, and everything sort of settled down around the time I went to Russia in 2000, but that the 90s was pretty tough.
Well, it was, because for many people it was a complete, I can just think of the French word, life was turned upside down economically and professionally. People who had good jobs, who were engineers and such, who'd worked for state agencies, all of that disappeared, and people had to figure out new ways of making a living.
Right.
So it was very, it was a very difficult transition.
Well, that's interesting. We were talking about Homo Sovieticus and the idea of initiative. So conformity seemed to be an important thing for Soviet man, right? Conformity. And that, dissidents were dealt with very harshly. And then suddenly they have to take initiative because they're going into a free market system. So that would be...
So a lot of people were actually going into business, but the problem is that it was the managers of the state enterprises. They had the most ready access to resources, right? So, the people who are oligarchs today, a lot of them, the first wealthy class were essentially people who had been managing factories and enterprises, state enterprises. They became the new owners, right? And then there was actually a lot of initiative, people going into business, but it was also rather lawless.
Yes,
There was a lot of criminal gang kind of activity. People had to pay bribes to do to get anything done, and
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, where is it? I've lost my train of thought. Slavic culture, as contrasted with mainstream American culture. Now, when I asked you that,
I need to stop you and ask you what you mean by Slavic culture.
I don't know.
Well, that's basically like saying Romance culture, right? So you've got French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, right?
Okay.
Those are, they share language roots.
All right. Okay.
So what...
I stand
Can
corrected.
we say Romance culture?
No, not really. No, but I didn't know that in the sense that, I've heard it bandied about, the term Slavic culture. So I thought there was some kind of commonality or some kind of basis for that.
Well, so first of all, the Slavic languages are divided into several groups. There's Southern, Northern, and I think Western Slavic languages. So there are slight differences, differentiations. But there were very different cultural experiences. You know, if you're talking about the Balkans and the Serbs and the Croats, you know, a lot of their history was, they're caught between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottomans, right? And for them, a lot of the fight, a lot of what they experienced was warring with the Ottomans, right? If you're talking about Poles or Czechs, for them, a lot of the pressure was from German. And then if you're talking about Ukrainians and Belarusians, the issue is being caught between Poland and Russia, right? So historically, people have different experiences. Then there are religious differences, right? Poles are Roman Catholic. So, okay, Ukrainians are Orthodox for the most part, but there's a substantial group that's Byzantine Catholic, right? The Czechs, there are Protestants amongst the Czechs, right? So the Czechs are Catholic, Protestant, Czechs are not Orthodox. So there really are enormous differences across different...
so actually, we really shouldn't bother to use that term. It's just...
Well,
it's not useful.
I personally don't think it's useful because I think it covers up a lot of important distinctions.
Oh, interesting,
you know?
yeah. Well,
it's a term that Putin uses.
There we go.
Right?
I knew I heard it somewhere.
Slavic brothers, right?
Okay.
And so that term has been used for imperial purposes as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, oh, that's really interesting. So perhaps that is, I don't know where I, have gleaned this term, and I don't, it just kind of got into my program here, but yeah. But trying to talk about anything related to American culture as, say, in contrast to Ukrainian culture, do you see any obvious differences?
Well, I think that Ukrainians tend to be more direct.
That's why you just stopped me dead in my tracks.
Interrupting is not a terrible thing.
Okay.
There are sort of jokes about, you put 3 or 4 Ukrainians together and you have 3 or 4 conversations going. Yeah, so, I'm particularly interested in communication behavior, so
of course.
Those are things that...
But that's interesting because, like in the Robert Cole's Values Americans Live By, that spectrum of direct to indirect, that continuum, the U.S. is considered very, very direct, and so you're saying Ukrainians are even more direct.
Well, let's look within American culture, right? If you're comparing, for example, a Mainer compared to an Italian from New Jersey, or a Jewish person from New York, or a Los Angeles and a Los Angelino, I think that their communication behavior is going to be different.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So within American culture, there are already cultural differences, right?
Right.
So, I personally feel a lot more comfortable with sort of the New York Jewish style.
Well, so the whole notion of mainstream American culture seems to be just mythology, really. You know what I mean? It's almost like just the way you were talking about Stalin Russifying all of the Soviet Union. It almost seems that was a mainstream culture, right? So it almost seems like mainstreaming or trying to create a mainstream culture is a superimposition on diversity. And it's a non-recognition of diversity.
You can make some generalizations, right? It's possible to make generalizations, and you and I do that all the time when we work with international students, right? We make certain generalizations and say, well, Americans would tend to do X, Y, or Z, right?
Yeah, well, I personally think the mainstream American culture is, it's consumption, and it's the movie industry, and all those things.
Social media.
Yeah, but all those things are sort of what supposedly, ties us together, and I don't think that's adequate at all.
And those things change very quickly. When I started teaching, One of the things that I felt was a mystery to international students coming to the U.S. was the role of religion in American life and how important it is, and how the media that that had shaped their idea of American culture, they had, television and movies, they had no idea how religious Americans were at the time, right? I mean, at that time, you had enormous percentages of people saying that they regularly went to church, they believed in God, blah, blah, and so on and so forth. But now you look at, for example, Pew Research, and the number of church-going people and people that tell you that they believe in God has dramatically fallen in the last 20 years.
Oh.
Right? So things change. Things change.
Right, right. Things change, but I still think that, how are you tying that in with my talk about mainstream?
You can. I think that it's possible to make certain generalizations, but.
Oh, I see. But those generalizations.
But they're snapshots. Yes,
Okay.
they're snapshots.
Yeah.
They're at a given time, right?
Got it.
I mean, if you're talking about American culture in the 50s, it was very different from the 70s and 80s, and then now it's really quite different.
Yeah.
Right?
Radically different. Do you have any questions?
No, things change over time, and you've noticed this. It's true everywhere, not just in America.
Right.
So,
right.
What are some of the biggest changes you've seen in Ukraine, you think, over the last 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, during the independence period.
Well, I think that the young generation now, they consider themselves European. This business of a Soviet identity, their parents and grandparents identify with that. And there is an older generation that's still kind of nostalgic. They had paid vacations to Crimea and, vacations at the spa and, and they made jokes like they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. and that's really foreign to the young generation. They consider themselves European. They want to live in a free society and have self-determination, not just individually, but as a society. They're savvy in terms of business, in terms of media, in terms of global culture. The people were culturally isolated in the Soviet Union, almost Sovieticus was in many ways kind of, not very. It was hard, and it was maybe even frowned upon for them to follow what was, I remember when I was in college, and I did a year abroad during college, and some of my classmates actually went to the Soviet Union. They sold every pair of jeans that they had, right? And that was because that was like people couldn't get a hold of that stuff or of rock and roll records, right? So you've got a generation that grew up under completely different circumstances, right? And of course the media changes have also, it's amazing to me now, people are in touch in real time immediately during the war, right? People are talking to each other on the phone and that you can hear the bombs in the background and stuff. And the guys from the battlefield are putting stuff out on Telegram and videos and
wow.
Right? So
well, technology has absolutely changed everything about life. That's the way I feel. But going back to Homo Sovieticus, I'm just so fascinated with this type, and I want to ask you, do you think that Putin is a Homo Sovieticus? Or if he is, in what ways?
He's very much a product. He's very much a product of that system. He was a KGB agent, and his entire psychology, I think, is KGB. But he imagines himself Peter the Great.
Oh.
Right? So the Soviet Union was a Soviet empire, but there was a pre-Soviet Russian empire.
Of course, the Tsar.
And that's
the
what and I think that's what Putin, aspires to, is to to resurrect that empire. I mean, he has said on numerous occasions that the fall of the Soviet Union was the worst thing that happened in the 20th century, right?
Right.
So, yes and no. I don't know. You scratch the Soviet Union just a little bit, and there's Russian Empire under there. So,
Well, my question was, is he an example of Homo Sovieticus? Well, I think he wants his people to be Homo Sovieticus. He wants his people to be the way they were in the Soviet Union, which in
passive.
Yeah, passive.
But the Russians have been passive historically. The revolution was a rare occurrence in Russia, actually. Okay, there were not rebellions. You had the 19th century in other places where you had, in France, for example, a labor movement, and the 1848 revolutions.
So, what do you explain that how do you explain that passivity? Is it just the size of the country that they couldn't organize? Or?
I don't know. I don't know, but I mean, this is not my, this is not my opinion. There are people who have written about that. I don't know, but the one other thing that has to be noted about Putin is that he's also using the Orthodox Church. So that's a huge turnaround with the Soviet Union, right? With the church was basically the church served the state, but you weren't supposed to go to church, right? And you weren't supposed to be religious. But now he's unifying his, imperial ideology with the tradition of the church. So.
But why did you say the church served the state? I thought in the atheist state the church was not supposed to exist.
It did.
It did exist.
There was there was a Moscow patriarch who basically was a government official.
Wow.
In the same way in China, you have the same thing in China. There are Catholic bishops in China that basically work at the behest of the Communist Party, and that's actually an issue for Catholics. Like, are they going to go with underground Catholics or the state approved?
Oh, wow, jeez. I don't know why I became so obsessed with this Soviet man thing. I think I just like the way Homo Sovieticus sounds. It sounds like, like something that got discovered in the Rift Valley or something. It sounds like something archaeological, But I want to learn more about it, and you did recommend that book, and I'm going to look into it more. Do you have another question?
Are you surprised at how hard the Ukraine has fought back against the war?
I'm not surprised.
You're not. That's because
I think the world should not have been surprised,
Yeah.
but the world has not been paying attention actually to what's been. I think that the Russian narrative has been bought until very recently. That Ukraine didn't exist, and it's people just weren't. I think there was just not enough really attention paid to what was really going on. Yeah.
I do have a question, about the metaphors for American culture. When we met in the early 90s in Boston, it was just when the metaphor of the melting pot was changing to the metaphor of the salad bowl. And what I want to ask you is, how do you view these metaphors in light of our present day political and cultural upheavals? That's a biggie.
Clearly not a melting pot, right?
Yeah, but I mean, but do you think that some of the political forces in the U.S. don't they want that kind of sameness? You know what I mean? Like the melting pot, the assimilation model.
It's not sameness; it's supremacy.
Oh,
some of those people want to be on top and in charge, and.
Wait a minute, when you say it's not sameness, it's supremacy, I didn't quite follow that.
Okay, so if you're talking about the right-wing resistance to, growing diversity and diversity and inclusion on the one hand, right? Black Lives Matter and basically the shrinking percentage of the white population,
right.
And the fear they want to replace us.
Yeah, right.
Well, what are they? What's the fear? we're not going to be on top anymore. We're not going to have the
Oh,
white
okay.
privilege.
So you
right?
said it's not sameness, it's what was the word? Supremacy.
Supremacy.
Supremacy, got it.
We want to continue. I mean,
That's very interesting. Yeah.
it's a reaction
Yes, I see.
to remain
On top.
on top.
Yes. And also, I want to talk about, I recently took a trip to the Balkans, and I crossed 8 borders, and I stayed in hostels, and I heard many languages, talked to many people, and it was just such a pleasure. And I told them how lucky they were to so, have such access to so many different cultures and languages in a relatively short, space, geographical space, because it's much, much smaller, right, than the United States. And so, this whole idea of multilingualism versus monolingualism, it's like, do you think that the U.S. will ever wake up to the benefits of multilingualism and require everybody to learn Spanish, for example?
So you know the classic joke, right?
No.
What do you call? Oh, you must. What do you call someone that speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. What do you
Okay.
call someone that speaks 2?
Bilingual.
What do you call someone who speaks 1?
American. Okay. Well, anyway, it was just so nice, to be around all that, different cultures, different languages, and it's so beneficial. And do you, for example, this thing about worldview, when you code switch and you go back into Ukrainian, do you feel that these 2 worldviews that you might have are enriching to your life? Do you feel more enriched because you're bilingual and bicultural?
Absolutely. I think it's made me cognitively more flexible. Yeah, of course.
And so why wouldn't anybody want to access that experience,
Because they're insecure.
Yeah, because I love Spanish. I love traveling in Spanish-speaking countries. I love code switching to Spanish. I love feeling my Spanish-speaking persona. I love feeling like I do have a different worldview, because I really do feel that, and so I just want to promote it, and that's why I enjoyed that Balkan trip so much, because many trips, like some trips you take, you don't cross a lot of borders, but in 6 weeks I crossed 8 borders. So it really gives you a perspective of multilingualism and multiculturalism.
Don't you think it's the fear of the other
There we go.
that keeps us
It is the fear
Yeah.
of the other.
mono?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Lingual?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah. So how do we remedy that? By creating.
It's a good question.
By creating experiences in which the other is seen as desirable. So I've always found difference very desirable.
It seems like we're more headed that way than ever, doesn't it?
What?
In schools, it's like multiple cultures are embraced more so than ever, I think. I mean, growing up, it was...
Oh, definitely. From the time I was in school,
Yeah.
yes. Well,
We still have a long way to go.
But there's a reaction to that too, right? So now there's, book restrictions. You can't, all these, right? You can't have books about racial history. And I mean, really, things like To Kill a Mockingbird, right?
Are you serious? They're trying to ban that? Oh my goodness. Wow. Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, that was really a wonderful opportunity to have you here for another half hour. Even though I've known you for 28 years, I actually learned a lot of things I didn't know in this conversation. And I really appreciate your coming down, because I know you're very busy. And
Thank you.
So, and I hope that people are able to get to the Ukrainian art show in Fall River at what's the name of the gallery?
It's the Eye of the Beholder at the Bristol Community College Grimshaw Goodwitch Gallery.
Grimshaw Goodwitch Gallery. So everybody, try to make it down to this art show. And thank you again for watching Looking into Cultures, and we will see you next time. And in the great show we have prepared for next time, which will be about Mystic, Connecticut, in Looking into Culture.
Ciao.